Before you scroll past, stop and listen, because what you're about to hear isn't just another opinion. It's a truth too many are afraid to say out loud. This isn't 1967 anymore. The rules of war have changed, the battlefield has changed, and so has the world watching it unfold. In this speech, we're not here to take sides. We're here to challenge the illusion that might makes right, to uncover why, despite all the power, all the weapons, and all the victories, Israel cannot win this war, not this one. You'll hear about a system cracking under the weight of its own myth, about why force can destroy buildings, but never an idea, about how global opinion is shifting and how silence is no longer a weapon. This is about the truth behind the headlines, the reality behind the rhetoric, and the courage to speak on behalf of those whose voices are buried under rubble and noise. So lean in. Fought in open desert terrain, the objectives were strategic, and victory was measured by territorial gains. But the war Israel faces today, particularly in Gaza, and against groups like Hamas or Hezbollah, is fundamentally different. These are not state actors with clearly defined military targets. They are decentralized, embedded within civilian populations, and adept at guerrilla tactics. They operate from within dense urban environments, using the terrain to their advantage. Tunnel networks under Gaza, for instance, allow for covert movement, ambushes, and the hiding of weaponry in ways that a traditional army cannot match. This evolution creates a battlefield that is invisible, unpredictable, and impossible to conquer without inflicting massive civilian casualties. Additionally, the proliferation of inexpensive yet advanced technologies, drones, homemade rockets, encrypted communications, has leveled the playing field in unprecedented ways. Groups with limited resources can now launch attacks that reach deep into Israeli territory, creating a sense of insecurity disproportionate to their actual military capabilities. The Iron Dome can intercept many of these threats, but it cannot prevent the psychological and political impact of their mere existence. This constant, low-grade warfare erodes the sense of control Israel once held. The enemy is no longer just on the borders, it is beneath, within, and around, hidden in plain sight and blended into the urban sprawl. Furthermore, the global media landscape has become a crucial front in this modern conflict. Every missile strike, every civilian casualty, every destroyed building is broadcast in real time to a global audience. The asymmetry isn't just in military power, but in perception management. Resistance groups exploit this dynamic, knowing that they cannot match Israel's firepower, but they can win the battle for global sympathy and legitimacy. Civilian deaths and humanitarian suffering, whether intentionally inflicted or collateral, are instantly transformed into moral indictments. In this modern era of asymmetrical warfare, Israel cannot rely solely on military superiority. The rules have changed, the battlefield has shifted, and the old playbook no longer guarantees victory. Global public opinion has undergone a seismic shift since 1967, especially in how it perceives conflict in the Middle East. In the aftermath of the Six-Day War, Israel was largely viewed as a small, embattled nation fighting for survival against a coalition of larger Arab states. The Western world, particularly the United States and Europe, sympathized with Israel's position and celebrated its swift and decisive military success. The narrative then was one of David defeating Goliath. However, over the decades, that image has evolved and in many ways reversed. With decades of occupation, repeated wars in Gaza, rising civilian death tolls, and the expansion of settlements in the West Bank, Israel is increasingly seen by much of the world not as a defender, but as an occupying power. The emergence of social media has radically accelerated this shift in perception. Where once governments and mainstream media controlled the story, now videos of destruction, injured children, and grieving families circulate in real time from the conflict zone. A single viral image from Gaza can do more to shape public perception than a dozen official statements. This democratization of information has made it impossible for any one side to monopolize the narrative. Every Israeli airstrike that hits a civilian target is scrutinized, debated, and condemned across platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. The human cost of war is no longer an abstract idea. It's a visible, emotional, and immediate experience for global audiences. Younger generations around the world, particularly in the West, are increasingly critical of what they perceive as an imbalance of power and justice on college campuses, in grassroots movements, and in public discourse. Support for Palestinian rights has grown significantly. Unlike their parents, these younger observers are less influenced by the legacy of World War II and the early years of Israeli statehood. They are more influenced by principles of human rights, anti-colonialism, and social justice. This change in global sentiment has begun to reflect in international institutions, protests, diplomatic discourse, and even policy making in certain countries. Israel, once seen as a moral force for survival, now often finds itself on the defensive in the court of public opinion. The erosion of moral authority, amplified by each civilian tragedy, undermines its legitimacy and soft power, complicating its ability to justify its military actions on the world stage. The regional landscape surrounding Israel has dramatically changed since 1967. Rendering past military strategies less effective and creating a more volatile, unpredictable environment. In 1967, Israel faced unified national armies from Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. These states had clear borders, centralized governments, and uniform militaries that operated in conventional ways. The objectives were defined, and once ceasefires were signed and territory seized, a form of resolution, however fragile, was reached. But in the present era, the nature of Israel's adversaries and the geopolitical dynamics of the Middle East are vastly different. The once unified Arab front has splintered, with many states either embroiled in internal conflicts or shifting their focus to diplomacy, economic development, or countering other regional powers like Iran and Turkey. Some, like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, have even normalized relations with Israel through the Abraham Accords, signaling a strategic pivot away from open hostility. However, while traditional state actors have receded from direct conflict, a new and more dangerous class of opponents has emerged. Non-state actors like Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Iranian-backed militias in Syria and Iraq. These groups do not operate within the traditional constraints of borders or state responsibilities. They use asymmetric tactics, blend into civilian populations, and are ideologically driven in ways that make them more resilient and harder to deter. They are not interested in temporary ceasefires or territorial negotiations, but in long-term resistance and the gradual erosion of Israel's security and legitimacy. The influence of Iran in particular has grown significantly, adding another layer of complexity. Iran supports and funds many of these groups, enabling them to acquire more advanced weaponry, training, and coordination. This means Israel is no longer just facing threats from its immediate neighbors, but is entangled in a wider regional proxy struggle. The battlefield now stretches from the Gaza Strip to southern Lebanon to the Syrian Golan Heights, and even beyond, into cyberspace and regional diplomacy. Unlike in 1967, where the war was largely confined to clear geographic boundaries, today's conflict is dispersed, multifaceted, and continuous. This fragmentation of threats and the blurring of conventional warfare lines have made it nearly impossible for Israel to secure lasting victories through military means alone. Every offensive operation risks triggering broader regional escalations, while every act of retaliation fuels cycles of vengeance and instability. The old strategic map is obsolete, and the new one offers no clear path to peace or security. The myth of Israel's military invincibility, forged during the lightning victory of the 1967 Six-Day War, is slowly but unmistakably eroding. That war saw Israel defeat several Arab nations in less than a week, capturing vast territories and shocking the world with its precision, strategy, and force. It created a narrative of military supremacy that endured for decades and shaped not only Israel's identity, but also regional perception. However, the conflicts Israel faces today are no longer those of tanks and jets in open terrain, but of unpredictable, drawn-out, urban, and ideological battles that expose vulnerabilities which did not exist in 1967. The perception that Israel can strike at will, dominate any adversary, and walk away unscathed is no longer tenable. The rise of irregular warfare, missile threats from Gaza and Lebanon, cyber attacks, and the capacity of enemies like Hamas and Hezbollah to survive and regroup after major Israeli offensives have chipped away at the aura of unstoppable power. Despite Israel's advanced technology, missile defense systems like the Iron Dome, and overwhelming air superiority, it still finds itself unable to permanently eliminate these threats. By this, the air missile defense systems is decimated and unable to permanently eliminate these threats. And it is irrational to doubt that this is the third most oppressively to make a show of force until with each round of conflict, whether in Gaza or along the northern border, Israel's inability to achieve decisive outcomes becomes more apparent. The enemy adapts, survives, and reemerges, often stronger in the realm of public perception, if not militarily. Domestically, this fading sense of invincibility is being felt as internal divisions deepen within Israeli society. Political polarization, mass protests, growing dissent among military reservists, and debates about judicial overreach have all contributed to a weakening of national unity. The Israeli public, once broadly confident in the military's ability to provide security, is now increasingly skeptical and weary of perpetual war without resolution. Faith in long-standing strategies is diminishing, and trust in leadership is under strain. There is a growing recognition that brute force cannot resolve an ideological, humanitarian, and geopolitical crisis that has persisted for generations. Internationally, the erosion of the invincible image has geopolitical consequences. Adversaries grow bolder, allies become more cautious, and neutral observers become more critical. Israel still wields immense military power, but its inability to achieve lasting peace, deter non-state enemies, or silence growing global opposition reveals the limits of that power. The shield of myth that once protected it is now cracked, and every new conflict exposes those cracks more clearly to the world. In 1967, Israel was able to frame its military actions as necessary for survival, gaining widespread international support and legitimacy. The world saw a young nation surrounded by hostile enemies, defending itself against annihilation. Its territorial acquisitions were viewed by many as defensive buffers, not aggressive expansions. That narrative carried weight for decades, especially in the West. However, over time, as the occupation of Palestinian territories became prolonged, the moral clarity that once surrounded Israel's military operations has significantly eroded. The continued expansion of settlements in the West Bank, the repeated blockades and bombardments of Gaza, and the absence of a political resolution have shifted global opinion. What once appeared as defensive measures are now widely seen as acts of control, domination, and disregard for international law. The occupation is no longer justifiable in the eyes of much of the world because it has persisted for over half a century, without a clear path to peace. Settlements continue to grow, often at the expense of Palestinian homes and lands, undermining any prospects for a two-state solution. The separation wall, checkpoints, and military presence in civilian areas portray a daily reality of restriction and humiliation for Palestinians, and this reality is no longer hidden. It is visible through social media, journalism, and first-hand testimonies that reach a global audience instantly. The perception of Israel as a democratic, liberal outpost in the Middle East is being increasingly challenged by images and reports of occupation, forced evictions, and unequal treatment of Arabs under its control. International human rights organizations, including those once reluctant to criticize Israel, have now begun labeling aspects of its policies as apartheid. This terminology, once considered taboo, is gaining traction in diplomatic and academic circles, further damaging Israel's moral standing. Young people, particularly in Western countries, are growing more vocal in their support for Palestinian rights, shifting the political landscape. The old justifications no longer resonate in a world that places greater emphasis on human rights, justice, and equality. Israel's military actions are now judged not just by their tactical outcomes, but by their ethical implications. Civilian casualties, particularly of women and children, dominate global headlines and feed a growing narrative of imbalance and brutality. This shift in moral perception makes every military campaign more costly, not just in terms of lives and resources, but in terms of credibility, legitimacy, and international standing. Military victories in today's geopolitical climate no longer translate into long-term political solutions, especially in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In 1967, Israel captured vast territories in a short period and gained a strategic military edge that reshaped the regional balance of power. The swift defeat of neighboring armies was seen as a decisive victory, and the territorial gains were leveraged in diplomatic arenas. However, in the current era, military success no longer provides a clear path to peace or resolution. Even if Israel were to dismantle Hamas's infrastructure in Gaza or neutralize other militant threats, it would still be left confronting the deeper, unresolved root causes that fuel the cycle of conflict, namely occupation, displacement, inequality, and the denial of basic rights to millions of Palestinians. The core issues driving resistance remain untouched by airstrikes and ground invasions. Generations of Palestinians have grown up under occupation, with limited freedom of movement, uncertain futures, and deep psychological scars. Bombing buildings and targeting militant leaders may degrade the immediate capabilities of a group like Hamas, but it does nothing to address the collective grievances of the population. On the contrary, every act of destruction often breeds more resentment, radicalization, and hopelessness. Without a credible political horizon, military operations merely delay the next explosion rather than prevent it. The use of force may create temporary calm, but that calm is inherently unstable and unsustainable in the absence of justice. Israel's attempts to achieve security through force have proven to be a cycle of repetition. Each conflict in Gaza follows a similar pattern: intense violence, global outrage, ceasefires, and then eventual relapse into tension. This pattern has become predictable, and its ineffectiveness increasingly clear. The assumption that military dominance alone can bring peace is outdated and counterproductive. Lasting peace requires diplomacy, empathy, compromise, and a willingness to confront hard truths. It requires acknowledging Palestinian aspirations for statehood, dignity, and sovereignty. Israel's military actions may bring tactical victories, but without a parallel political process grounded in equality and mutual recognition, those victories are hollow. They fail to break the cycle, fail to shift the dynamics, and ultimately fail to achieve security in any meaningful or permanent sense. The battlefield may show Israeli strength, but the streets, the narratives, and the international discourse reveal an absence of strategic resolution. Force alone cannot silence a people's longing for freedom. Israel's struggle today is not a repeat of 1967. It's a completely different war, fought on unfamiliar terrain, both literally and morally. The days of clear victories and celebrated dominance are gone. The enemy is no longer an army across a border, but an idea rooted in generations of suffering and resistance. Asymmetrical warfare, shifting global opinion, fractured regional alliances, a crumbling myth of invincibility, moral erosion in the face of occupation, and the absence of a political solution all point to one hard truth. This war cannot be won through military power alone. What once worked in an era of tanks and territory now fails in the face of digital warfare, ideological resilience, and global accountability. Lasting peace, security, and dignity will not come through force, but through justice. Not by silencing the oppressed, but by listening to them. Not by destroying hope, but by creating it. Until that shift happens, not just in policy, but in mindset, Israel will keep winning battles, but losing the war. We all find the courage to seek understanding over revenge, justice over domination, and peace over pride. Good luck on your journey to awareness, change, and action, because in the end, only truth and compassion can break the cycle. Stay strong, stay informed, and never stop asking the hard questions.